In this two-part lesson, we'll take a look at using a particle system to create bubbles for a champagne glass. And we'll start by creating particles in After Effects, then we'll bring our particle artwork over to Photoshop and apply some masking and 3D effects. Now, if you've been following any of our studio's animation work, you'll see that particles are one of our favorite features in After Effects because you can achieve just about any effect, from underwater light reflections to snow, rain, bubbles, water, anything you can imagine. So if you're following along, we'll start this lesson with a new, untitled After Effects project. Then we'll import the file named champagne_glasses.jpg from folder 5 in the chapter 3 folder of the exercise files. And once you've located the file, we'll import this into the project panel and then create a composition by dragging this over into the composition panel. And so once you have your composition created, let's start by creating a solid so we can assign the particle effects to the solid. So let's come up to the layer menu, come down to New, choose Solid. We'll name this Particles. We'll choose Make Comp Size. Then click OK. The color doesn't matter. And now we're going to go back over to the Effects and Presets, and let's come in here and search for the word Particles. So I'll type in Particle. Here we can see CC Particle Systems 2 under the Simulation group. Let's click and drag this and apply this to the solid. Now, just like some of the other effects we've seen in the course, this particle system is actually part of an animation. So to see the animation, let's come down to the timeline panel and click and drag and see all of the particles being born in the center of the screen. Now, if you don't have enough time in your timeline panel, you can come up to the composition menu, come down to composition settings, and make sure you have at least 5 seconds or so in the duration. So mine has 10 seconds. So I'll click OK. So again, if we come down here and scrub this back and forth, you can see all of the particles on the screen. So what happens with particle systems is basically, if I come down to the 0 mark, there are no particles, and particles are born from a center point. So as I drag the timeline, you can see all of the particles being born and sort of spitting out from the center point and then animating across the composition. And the speed at which they animate, the speed that they fall, the number of particles, and where they're created are all controlled in the effect controls. And particle systems can be a rather complex effect to master. So what I'm going to be doing in this lesson is focusing specifically on the properties that will give us the bubbles effect. So let's go over to the effect controls, and let's come down and first go to the particle itself. So we'll toggle open all of the properties for particle. Under particle type, let's change this from a line, which is the default, down to shaded sphere. So that's immediately going to change the way the particles look on the stage. And then if I come down here and jog the timeline, you can see what that changes. And now before we continue changing the particle, let's come back to the effect controls. Let's open up the physics group, and let's come down here and change the animation type from explosive down to fire. So changing the animation type will automatically change a bunch of the environment properties, which include things like the gravity and the direction of the particles. So now if we jog the timeline, you can see the particles are born from the center point, and now they flow upward. So this has the same motion that we're going to be using for the bubbles. So at this point, I can just leave the playhead at around the 3 or 4 second mark. Now let's go back to the effect controls. Let's close up physics for the moment. Let's go back into the particle settings. Let's come in here and change the birth size. And I'm going to zoom up here a little bit just so you can see what's happening on my screen. So for the birth size, if we come in here and drag this up, this controls the size of the particles when they're born, which is at this center point right here. And then similarly, if I make this smaller, the particles will be born at a much smaller size. So for the birth size, we're going to come in here and set this to 0.015, then press return. Now that'll show in the interface as 0.01, but if you select the number, you'll see the 0.015. And then for the depth size, which is the size of the particles at the end of their life, let's come in here and set this to 0.03. So now at this point, it's getting pretty hard to see the particles. So let's jump down to the birth color. Let's click on the yellow swatch. Let's change this to black. Let's click OK. And let's go to the death color. And we're going to set this to be black as well. We want to have strictly black artwork because we're going to apply some effects later in Photoshop. And then let's come up to the size variation and change this from 50 to about 75, right about here. This will change the size of each of the individual particles and make them just a little more random. Now let's go back into the physics. Let's open this up. Let's come in here and change the velocity. The velocity is the speed at which the particles are coming out of the center point. So let's come in here and increase this up to about 4. So I'll just drag this up. And as I increase this, you can see the particles spreading out along the composition. Next, let's increase the gravity. So we're going to set this from 1 up to 6. And since we're using the fire animation type, this is going to make the particles move upward a lot faster. And now to get more bubbles on the stage, let's come up here to the very top property, the birth rate, and let's come in here and increase the number of particles that are being born. So as we increase this, you'll see that the number of particles is increasing, and we're seeing more particles throughout the entire area. So let's come in here and set this to 36 and then click away. And now we'll see many more particles showing up because more particles are being born per second. All of the other physics are still taking effect, including the gravity and the velocity. But since we have so many more particles being born, we're seeing more of them on the screen. And now let's go back down to the particle section. Let's come down to maximum opacity, and let's increase this up to 100%. We want to make sure that there's no transparency for any of these particles. And now the last thing we need to do for the particles is come down here and change the producer, or the center point. So you can come in here and click on the center point. Let's click and drag this to the bottom of the glass. And I want to make sure that there are particles all around the outside edge of the glass. We'll mask the particles inside of the glass when we get to Photoshop. So at this point, let's first save our After Effects project. So let's go to the File menu. Let's choose Save. We'll name this bubbles.aep. Come down and click Save. And now with our After Effects project saved, let's save a version over to Photoshop so we can apply the final effects. So let's go up to the Composition menu. Come down to Save Frame As, choose Photoshop Layers, and we'll name this bubbles.psd, and then hit Save. And now on the desktop, we have a brand new After Effects project file, as well as a Photoshop file that we're going to open in part 2 of this lesson.